Thank you very much, Ian. Very kind as always. I have to be apologetic because I am long retired, and so I don't give talks very often. In fact, my last was Psychology in the Pub, organised in a pub in Oxford by the West Midlands Psychology. So I'm at that level. So I'm really what you might describe as these days a stand-up psychologist rather than a practicing eminent academic. The other thing was I wasn't certain about who the audience to this lecture would be. I knew that some of them would be intensely sharp colleagues from the local aging community, aging research community. I was told that there might also be people from other faculties, and so I've given a kind of compromise talk. And you'll just have to put up with it because it's too late to change anything. Having completed my apologies, here we go. Yes. There's a lag. So do we get more grumpy as we get older? And an attempt at humour. I've not got the... If you look at the published literature on joy, and joy is a word that will occur, it occurred in the title just to draw people in, but it will occur very rarely during the talk itself. But this actually measured joy, and it was a large national survey in Australia. What it says roughly is that you start out being pretty cheerful, you get morose in your middle age, and then you cheer up wonderfully as you get older. And there are different views because the data have been reanalyzed and other data have been collected, and these are the counter views. But the counter views aren't very counter. The counter view analyses say that you don't get more cheerful all the time until you die. The last years might not be as good as the ones that were immediately before. So that's roughly the general picture within which the data I have to present are going to be part. And the problem is to unpack relationships, because we all know that lots of different things, very disparate things, can lead to joy and to misery. And these things are intensely correlated with each other. And these are the sorts of things which correlate with depression in old age. Now, depression, as I'm using it tonight, is a weasel word. I've used the word depression because the way we've measured depression is on depression scores. That is things called the Beck and the Yesovich depression inventories, which are used for clinical diagnosis. As I'll try and point out, that for normal populations, these inventories are not very useful. And there are good reasons why. But you need a score, you need something to measure depression. This is the best we can do. Health is a more obvious one. We have health indicators. Cognitive performance, you'll hear more about. And then there's your engagement with life, the amount of physical activity and social engagement, and however you measure it, general quality of life. And of course, it's always interesting that a good test of how well you're doing is how soon you're going to die. So that is included too. Let's look, we're looking largely tonight at depression with the subtitle that I'm really talking about contentment and not proper clinical depression. And it's only one of a range of determinants. And by focusing on this relationship, we can tease out some wider picture, perhaps. I've solved the problem with this. It's the lag. You press the button and then nothing happens for a long time, and so you think that you've done the wrong thing and press another button, and that doesn't work. However, here we are. An illustration is increasing bias in longitudinal samples as people get older. You recruit a longitudinal sample, you recruit people at disparate ages at a particular point in time. They all grow old. Some of them, when you recruited them, were older than others. Some of them survive, others don't. So by the end, you're left with an elite sample, quite atypical of a normal community. These are people who've lived long. Not only have they lived long, but in our case, they turned out in February in Manchester and Newcastle to attend a boring psychological laboratory to do boring tests. And they did this year after year. So they are exceptional people in many ways. And they drop out of longitudinal studies because they die or becoming frail and approaching death. And there's convincing evidence that this affects estimates of age-associated change in cognitive abilities. And this is simply to describe the tests we use, and for those of you who are, as it were, professional psychologists, and those were they. We recorded dates and causes of death for 2499 volunteers. They were cognitively assessed 2 different test batteries, alternated every 2 years. So the interval between doing the same test would be 4 years. But in between, you'd have had 2 years ago another test battery with similar tests on it. And that's what happens. Now this, I'll tachistoscopically show you this and then go on to this. The first thing to look at is people with lower intelligence test scores who enter the study tend to drop out earlier and decline faster. This is the point to look at here. It's this axis here, so that these people who are going to either withdraw or die, W is withdraw and D is die, these chaps, when they entered the study, were relatively disadvantaged. Their scores were about 15 points lower than others. Those who are going to die quite soon, or withdraw and then die quite soon, we knew that because we collected death certificates, and whatever age they died, whether they belonged to the study or not, they could do that. And so it goes until you get to these people here who continued with the study, and and as far as we know, until 2004, we didn't lose track of them. Some of them are alive today, and when they entered the study, were better than everybody else. So the point is that people with a long expectancy of life, and a long expectancy particularly of stamina, if you like, are going to have higher intelligence test scores. The next point is that over everybody, and I think you saw that from the graph, cognitive decline accelerates as death approaches. Unsurprising, perhaps, but there it is. It's the sort of thing you have to take into consideration if you're looking at other variables, that you've got this variable changing. They also become too frail to continue at die at later ages, and the most able people show improvement or practice effects during the early part of the study. You see these people here who are quite able. They got the test on this occasion. 4 years later, they got the same test. They're now better, and other analyses of data show that this is a statistically reliable increase. These people don't get much better. They can't do very much better on this test, but they at least get no worse. And when they decline less steeply than these other people. So people who are going to survive for at least 8 years, in this case, are declining much less fast than people who are going to survive for shorter periods of time. And the most able people show improvements in practice effects. That is another thing you have to take into consideration, and you also have to take into consideration that in general, on longitudinal studies like this, the people who are most intelligent show the most improvement. I think it's a great, impressive achievement for our species that you can remember and score better on a test which you did 4 years ago. I'm not sure that I could, but certainly these volunteers in Manchester could. It doesn't matter just that you're going to die. It makes a difference how you're going to die and what's killing you and how fast it's killing you. And the speeds of the different pathologies kill you make a difference to how much and how fast you decline. So it makes a difference how soon you're going to die. But what is going to kill you also makes a difference. And that's the paper in which it was published, and that describes the study, so I won't go into it. But the rates of cognitive decline differed across pathologies. If you're going to get dementias, hardly surprisingly, you declined rapidly. If you had an infection and died of that, then you also declined faster. They were slower for cancers, and they were most prolonged over a long period, but substantive decline for cardiovascular conditions. And these are the numbers, and I've highlighted accident to make a particular logical point on the next slide. This doesn't tell you anything about, this just tells you that there was decline associated with these causes of death. It doesn't tell you whether the decline for different causes of death were greater or smaller. You can't gather that from this graph. About accidents, which is a key point for interpreting this graph. Oh, we seem to be too far away from something. Yep, accidents, a significant cause of cognitive decline. Why? Because is this the future having premonitory effects on you? Unlikely. What's happening is that people become frail and so unstable, and the risk of having an accident increases, and being frail makes recovery from an accident less likely. So hence accidents, dying of accidents, that you're about to die of accidents, feeds in that way. But in this sense, and this is an interesting thing to get a handle on, having an accident is a marker for other things that are going on. It isn't any part of what is going on. It's a sign, a symptom, if you like, that there is trouble, or there has been recent trouble, and it is this trouble, precursor to the accident, which is changing your condition. So the effects of pathologies tend to interact with those of calendar age. That's another thing on that. I don't think it's necessary to go back to the numbers unless anybody is interested particularly, but cognitive declines associated with cancers occur faster in people aged over 70 than in those, or they're greater in people aged over 70 than in those aged under 60. And the same is true of other causes of death. So that if you're old, whatever is killing you is having its effects on your central nervous system more rapidly. Shall I try? Here we are. So a converse relationship, declines in cognitive performance, particularly intelligence and processing speed, predict mortality. It's not just true of current status, cross-sectionally measured at a single time point, but also rates of change. So what is predicting is not where you began, whether you were good or bad or a particular cognitive test, but how fast you decline on a cognitive test that signals that things are getting parlous for you. I wonder this isn't as convenient as clicking the screen so directly. I think, let's see if this works better. Yes, and this is from a paper which has just come out in Psychology and Aging. Stephen Aikile, who's here, did the analyses. I provided the data, and Paolo Gisletta provided, I suppose, a lot of the data analysis and a lot of the thinking. These are descriptions of the test batteries. We had 5 domains. Longitudinal factor analytic methods gave estimates of base levels and change in as a function of age, correcting for multiple exposures. And we used Cox proportional hazard analysis to predict mortality. I'm sorry, I simply can't get, that's better. To remind you of the measures, there's scores on an intelligence test. There's crystallized intelligence, and bear that in mind. It turns out to be interesting in a moment. And here it was simply your vocabulary score, how many words you used. There was verbal memory, memory for lists of words, and visual memory, memory for pictures. They were in fact Peanuts cartoons. And there was a joint measure processing speed, which is speed of visual search, and of letter-letter substitution coding. Sorry, Beverly, there is a long lag when you press the button. Yes, here we are. And this is the outcome. So the two big predictors are fluid intelligence and processing speed. Crystallized intelligence vocabulary also predicts, but that predicts your level of performance. Verbal memory and visual memory also make predictions. Yes, and this is currently in press or under review in psychological science. So these are cumulative predictions, influence of rate of change, as you see, and the cognitive predictions are intelligence only and processing speed only, processing speed in females and in males. And these are the intercepts, that is the level at which you started, of course, and these are the slopes, how fast you're changing. So you've now got cumulative predictive influence on mortality risk, and here you have it again. Much the same picture, nothing very new. And I draw your attention to the difference between fluid intelligence, GF, and GC. Fluid intelligence has long been known to be a predictor of mortality, of how soon you're going to die. So declines in fluid intelligence, described by Claymire artistically as the terminal drop, were recognized as a predictor of death. And fluid intelligence declines with age. Most previous studies, except some of our data, found that crystallized intelligence, vocabulary in this case, remains stable until late in life. So why in this analysis does life-stable GC predict mortality, while rate of change in GC does not? And that's interesting because it illustrates how no measure is uncontaminated. Because if you have a big vocabulary, it is likely that you've had an expensive or at least a prolonged education, and you've learned lots of words. It's likely if you've had such an education that you've had a good job and a good lifetime income. It's also likely that you've had better access to medical care. So that in this case, something which you're measuring as a cognitive variable is in fact picking up something quite different. It's picking up something about lifestyle. Whereas rate of change in vocabulary doesn't make this prediction. So this goes with the idea that if you continue measuring vocabulary throughout a person's life, there's very little change in it. And these analyses have been carried out on large groups of people of all kinds who may or may not be going to die soon, but it does mean that this particular talent, GC, is measuring your status, your socioeconomic status, but it's not measuring anything very important about your consciousness, about your mind. And here you have a nice analysis by Stephen, again, as usual, which tells you the relative importance of variables in predicting mortality. Sex predicts mortality because women notoriously live much longer. So it's a very strong predictor. Years of smoking is the next best predictor, and so you go down the list. Prescribed medications means, of course, how ill you are. Processing speed comes through, yes. Being a smoker at all, or being a smoker currently comes, yes. And S is slope, so that these are predictions where the slope of change in prescribed medications is acting as a predictor. These are just where the level is acting as a predictor. And you have verbal memory, physical mobility, and so it goes. So let's turn to contentment, which has most often been indexed by Beck Depression Inventory scores. Levels of depression, being depressed is not good for you. It predicts mortality overall across all causes of death. In particular, it's associated with poor prognosis in cardiovascular disease, so that if you have heart trouble, it's not a good thing to also be depressed, although having heart trouble will, of course, tend to make you depressed. It contributes to mortality risk in cancer, and it amplifies the effects of the predict prognosis and mortality from CVD, and are probably also independently associated with earlier mortality. And this, from the Netherlands, I like very much. It's depression and cardiovascular disease. It's a Dutch study, of course, the role of dirt, lifestyle, and health. So that generally your socioeconomic condition and your socioeconomic disadvantages are associated with being depressed, and being socially, economically disadvantaged is associated with earlier mortality. So you can, I'm beginning to shade into using the word contentment rather than depression for reasons which will become apparent in the late part of the talk. And obviously these include lifestyle factors and health and contentment. Apart from being unpleasant per se, being glum is bad for your health and reduces your chance of survival. What factors increase the risk of being glum in later life? This is a definition of measures again. We used as a measure of health the Cornell Medical Index, which is a checklist on which respondents tick off all physician-diagnosed illnesses from which they suffer. That's to say, they don't tick off illnesses they think they suffer. There has to be a medical diagnosis. It correlates extremely well with physicians' diagnoses. So there are many studies, including one by Neil Pendleton and Mike Horan and myself, which show that the predictions from the Cornell Medical Index are as good as predictions from a complete assessment by a geriatric physician. So that it works, in other words. And these predict depression scores at age 70. So this is as a single time point prediction. Your subjective health, hardly surprising. All mental health. I should have mentioned that the CMI, the Cornell Medical Inventory, has sections in which you describe whether you're depressed, whether you have other psychiatric symptoms. Difficulty in doing housework, that's a sort of operational thing. The number of friends you have, which is categorical, and your fluid intelligence again, and then nothing until half you wake up at night. So that if you wanted to write a kind of prescription for what would be a bad picture of a person who's likely to be depressed, then you accumulate all of these as indices of what might be going on. And this this is another depression inventory. We used two. One was the Beck and the other was the Yesevich. On the Beck, you get a somewhat wider range of things which turn out to be predictable. Wake up at night comes here, number of friends has fallen, sex is there. Women tend to be depressed more often than men. Difficulty doing housework again, sleep hours a night comes in for the first time, fluid intelligence and all mental health also. So there we go. And this is different because this is what predicts how you're going to change in mood, so that how your depression scores are going to change over your lifespan. Your age at introduction to the study predicts that. Your subjective health, self-rated, predicts that. Processing speed predicts that. Nothing else in particular predicts rate of change in depression. So dumb is associated with glum, and glum makes dumb more likely. You have a chicken and egg problem. What is driving what? And we ought to unpack this perhaps a bit. Now this is my little homily about depression inventories was meant to introduce this idea that if you are really depressed, as measured on a depression inventory, then changes in serotonin balance impair mood and reduce intelligence. And that's for long been the accepted story, that these are biochemical changes, and they affect both your intellect and your mood. But what we found on the Manchester sample was something odd, because people in the Manchester sample, who, as I say, were people who were very robust and doing rather well, and in general rather healthy and positive, otherwise they wouldn't have kept coming, they didn't declare themselves as being very depressed at all. So their depression scale scores were lower than those, on average, were lower than those for the population in average, the UK population at large. And the odd thing was that even at these very low levels of depression scores, and by low I do mean low, as you'll see in a moment, they're like differences in scores between 0 and 3. So answering no question about depression by saying yes, I am depressed in that particular way. Even these very slight differences, which are of less than average discontent, so which indicate less than average discontent, these minor differences were also making an effect on people's intelligence. So how do we move on? We've got to look at depression in two ways. You've got to say there are at least two styles of depression. There's one which is very severe, which is liable to get you diagnosed as depressed and earn you clinical treatment. And there's the normal everyday depression, which is perhaps reactive to your circumstances, your socioeconomic circumstances, your health, and so on. But if you give somebody a depression scale, and if you use intervals on this depression scale as all being equal to each other, you're deceiving yourself, because at the lower end of the scale, these intervals are measuring something quite different from they are measuring at the higher end of the scale. So that this is, do differences in depression scores mark the same? I've just said that, but I'll give you time to read it too and gather my breath. And these are the things we tried to look at. We tried to see whether things would move you up the depression scale, what would move you up the depression scale, and how moving up and down the depression scale affected your level of intelligence. And that's what we did. So everybody had completed the Yesovich Geriatrics Inventory, the Cornell to get their health, and the Heim-Age 4-1 to get their intelligence. And we looked at only two illnesses. One was hypertension and diabetes, and the other was cardiovascular problems, which was a very broad sample, perhaps too broad sample of problems, but there it is. We lumped everybody together because we otherwise would have run out of numbers. And so the median score, the median of 11, is what is normally found. Median score for this sample is 6. So these are all as a group, very cheerful people, unusually cheerful people. And they broke down into people who were very contented indeed, with very low scores from 0 to 3. They'd refused to say anything depressed them or that they had any worries at all. Less contented people with slightly higher scores, discontented and unhappy with above population average scores of 11 plus. So analytic models took into, so what we did was to see what got you promoted to the next level of depression. So what was the difference between these people here and these people here, and these people here and these people here, and these people here, these are here and these here, in terms of the things which were driving their depression. And we divided them into groups, as you see, and compared. There were 3 comparisons, obviously, between 4 groups. And this is, these are people who are very happy, really, who are much happier than average. And the interesting thing is that that being intelligent now drops out as a predictor or even as an associated variable. If you look at these, what is really going on is that it's whether you're ill or not, whether you live in Newcastle, where it tends to make you more depressed than living in Manchester, whether your age perhaps, and yes. Now, the main point is that within this low range of depression scores, if you look at two illnesses only, that's cardiovascular disease and diabetes, the negative relationship between contentment and intelligence is no longer found. This means that what is supporting a correlation between depression scores and intelligence at this low end of the scale, which puzzled Peter Donlan and Mike Watson and myself in 1996, what it is being ill. Being ill is making you depressed, and being ill is affecting your intelligence. So that at this level, what is shifting people up and down the scale is largely illness, and what the effects of intelligence are entirely explained by the effects of illness. This is the next thing. Here, yes, intelligence has come back, but is not significant here. And the other factors are much the same. These query marks are rather low levels of significance. So that on the whole, having cardiovascular problems is a factor in promoting you to a higher level of discontent. Living in Newcastle, unfortunately, is also a factor which promotes you to a higher level of discontent. Being intelligent is a factor that operates in a different way. It acts against your being promoted. And finally, so within this range, illness increases the risk of depression, but intelligence per se, independently of illness, is associated with less depression. And this means possibly that after the effects of illness have been taken into consideration, being more clever may allow you to cope better with life. This again is something which longitudinal studies tend to ignore. The fact that you're not just measuring a neutral variable like intelligence or age, it has no consequences on people's lives. Being bright has many consequences. It not only probably means that you're socioeconomically more advantaged, but it may also mean that those things which people who are less bright than you can't cope with are not such a problem. And this is the final comparison where unfortunately the titles have changed, I'm sorry about that, but this is the top, people who had the highest levels of depression scores against the people who had the next to highest level of depression scores. Being a woman is still a bad thing in the sense that you're more likely to be depressed if you're a woman. Living in Newcastle and intelligence and being less intelligent is a bad thing. That is the nonlinear relationship, and intelligence and sex is a good thing. In other words, if you're a woman, you are more likely to be depressed, but if you're a clever woman, this is moderated. And this is shown more clearly on the next slide, so that if you look at the odds of being in the unhappy group, in the most unhappy group, as against the mildly unhappy group, what you have is that for men, there's a change with your intelligence test scores, not a very great change. However, for women, there's a very marked change. So that being a woman and being clever as a woman protects you from most of those things, or many of those things, which make life less tolerable for women than for men. So in this range, CVD and diabetes no longer increase risk of depression. Higher intelligence reduces, and being a woman increases depression. Adverse socioeconomic factors also, Newcastle, you see, also increase the risk of depression, but being more intelligent reduces the risk of depression. associated with socioeconomic factors, and greater intelligence reduces the risk of depression associated with being a woman more than others. So that glumness increases the risk of dumbness, and dumbness increases the risk of glumness. Many reasons why glum is associated with dumb, but these alter with the level of glumness we examine. And so it goes, many reasons why dumb affects glum, but these change with the levels of dumbness that we examine. The levels of intelligence determine whether you're going to get an effect on depression or not. There are also sex differences, and medical epidemiologists wouldn't be surprised, and nor would my grandmother have been surprised by these complexities. My grandmother was not an epidemiologist, but she used to say, particularly in her last years, everything is very complicated, so this wouldn't have surprised her at all. And we might, as a community, begin to take note of these fascinating worms. Well, thank you very much, and I hope I haven't lowered your IQ test score.